My name is Galen Barbos. I am joined here by my colleagues Sydney Forrester and Eric O'Shaughnessy, and we're very happy to be sharing with all of you today some highlights from the latest edition of our annual report tracking income and other demographic trends for residential solar adopters. Before getting started, let me just run through the standard housekeeping items. First, the webinar is being recorded. We will post the recording of the webinar along with the slides up on the website within the next day or two. And we will show you the URL where you can find that shortly. We will have some Q&A at the end, hopefully 15 minutes or so. And I would just ask that all of you should see a Q&A box somewhere on your webinar console. So please enter questions as we go. Eric will be organizing those as we go, and hopefully we'll be able to get through as many of those as possible at the end. So with that, let's begin. I'm going to kick things off, and then we'll do a little bit of tag teaming as we progress through the deck here. So here we just show the full table of contents for the report. We're going to be covering much of that material, but not all of it. I will mention that the report is itself a slide deck. The webinar is essentially just an excerpted set of slides from the full report. So certainly feel free to peruse the larger report if any of the grayed out items listed here are of particular interest to you. So this report, which you've now been doing for a number of years, probably 6 or 7 years at this point, is focused on describing income and other demographic and socioeconomic trends for residential rooftop, or maybe more kind of technically correct, on-site solar photovoltaic adopters. And so just to be clear, we are not talking about community solar. That's kind of a whole separate category on its own. We're focusing really on residential households that have installed solar on their roof or otherwise on site. This report is built on an underlying address level data set that I'll describe more in a couple slides. And one of the key features of this data set is that it relies on household level income and other demographic information. And so it's fairly unique in that level of granularity, as well as in just the overall market coverage, the number of systems that we have within this data set. The report that we'll be talking about today is really intended to be kind of a foundational reference document. It's very descriptive and data-oriented. We have quite a bit of other work that we've done and continue to do that builds on this data and that explores individual questions in greater depth and with more sophisticated analysis. Really what we'll be sharing with you today is just largely a set of trends that kind of help to give a sense of how the market is evolving over time. The report, as well as other supporting material and other work that we've done in this area, is all available at the URL listed at the bottom of the slide here, solardemographics.lbl.gov. This is where you'll be able to find the webinar recording in a day or two. This is also where you can find a link to our online data visualization tool, which allows users to explore the data that we'll be looking at here today. And Eric will give a quick demo, just giving you all a sense of what that tool can do when we get to the end of the presentation. So real quickly, what is the data that we're using? As I mentioned, it's based on underlying address level data set. The starting point is our Tracking the Sun data set, which consists of street addresses and other information for about 2.7 million PV systems. We supplement that data with additional PV street addresses and data from two companies, BuildZoom and Ohm Analytics, who themselves are compiling that information largely from local building permitting data sets. And so together we have about 4.1 million residential PV systems in the data set. With those addresses, we can then append on a variety of different socioeconomic data. The main data set that we use for that purpose comes from Experian, their consumer view data product. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's where the income estimates and some of the other key socioeconomic attributes that we'll be presenting where those come from. So here we just have a sense of our data sample and market coverage over time. The figure on the left-hand side shows in the red line what percentage of the total US residential market is contained within our data set based on the year of install. And you can see pretty consistently over time, we're capturing somewhere between 80 and 90% of the installs in each year. The figure on the right shows market coverage by state, just for 2023 systems. And you can see, variation across states. Certainly, in many states, we've got, upwards of 80% or more of the market within our data set, though there are clearly some lighter colored states as well, where our sample coverage isn't as strong. But overall, in aggregate, we've got 87% of the US residential market contained within our data set. Here we see trends in the kind of the geographical distribution of our sample over time. And you can see here, and this really just largely reflects kind of what's happening with the larger residential solar market. And you can see that California and the Northeast have both declined in their share of the sample over time, though they still represent a disproportionately large share of the sample as they do of the larger market. Florida, Texas, and some of the other southeastern states, those have grown in terms of their market share over time. And later on, these trends will be important to understand just as context for some of the larger kind of shifts that we see in the income characteristics of solar adopters nationally, kind of reflecting some of these underlying geographical shifts in the market. Last, a few quick points on the data and the methods. So for the presentation and the report, we're really focusing on national and to some extent state level trends. But within the online solar demographics tool, you can dig into the data and break it out more granularly down to the county or even to the census tract level. So that's part of the reason why we provide that tool online. The income data and other demographic information, as I mentioned, we are purchasing from Experian. It's important to understand that the income data are themselves estimates. Experian has a proprietary model that they use to estimate income at the household level. And so that's what we're using. So these are estimates. It's not actual reported income data. And furthermore, the income estimates refer to kind of present day income of each household. And so where we show time trends, it's important to understand that what we're doing there is we're comparing the current incomes of, say, relatively recent solar adopters to the current incomes of households that adopted solar, a decade or more ago. So these are current income estimates. So with that, let's get into some of the trends, focusing here on 2023 solar adopters. The figure just shows the distribution and household incomes across all of these 2023 adopters. And you can see, a wide distribution. Solar adopters span all different household income ranges and include many households that would likely be considered medium or even lower income households. About 44% of all of these adopters had household incomes less than 100,000. A little bit more than a third were 100 to 200K, and then the remaining 19% were above 200,000. That big spike on the right-hand side, that just reflects the fact that all of the incomes above 250,000 are all consolidated together into a single bin. But obviously, if you were to plot this out fully, that it would be a long gradual tail. Now, notwithstanding the fact that solar adopters come from all different swaths of the income, they do in general skew high relative to the broader US population. And you can see that here by comparing. On the right-hand side, we show the median income of all solar adopters in 2023. It was about 115,000. You can compare that then to all US households, which is the bar chart on the left. Median income was 75,000. And so that's a pretty big difference. Now, of course, most residential solar adopters own their own home for kind of basic structural reasons that it generally is necessary to own the rooftop in order to put a PV system on it. And so if we compare solar adopters to just owner-occupied households, which is the middle bar, the skew is considerably smaller, just about a 23% difference between those two groups. Now, another confounding factor here is that solar adoption is disproportionately located in relatively high income states, California in particular. And so that kind of further complicates these comparisons. But if we control for that through the weighted averages shown in the dots, that skew shrinks even further. And so if looking, for example, at a weighted average income for all owner-occupied households, it's a difference just between 107,000 and 115,000. So pretty modest difference there. So bottom line, there's a skew, but the degree of skew really depends on how you make that comparison. And we formalize that through a metric that we refer to as relative income. And relative income is really just the percentage of an individual household's income compared to all households within some comparison population. And you can define that comparison population at different scales. So nationally, the US, all the way down to the block group surrounding an individual PV adopter. You can also define it based on all households within that region or just owner-occupied households in that region. And so the figure here shows median relative incomes for all of these different permutations of that metric. And really the basic story here is that the skew between solar adopters and other households, it shrinks as you make the comparison more localized, so going from the US all the way down to the block group. And it also shrinks, as we saw on the previous slide, when comparing just to owner-occupied households. And so if you're comparing solar adopters to owner-occupied households within the same tract, county, or state, you can see that it's pretty close to parity, that there's very, very little difference between those groups. So those were national trends. These are showing relative income levels on a state basis. And really the only point I want to stress here is that there's just quite a bit of variation across states when looking at solar adopter relative incomes. And that variation can reflect a whole variety of different factors. It can reflect the maturity of the solar market within a particular state. It can reflect policies and programs that might be helping to encourage or support adoption by less affluent households. And then last but not least, it can reflect just broader socioeconomic factors within a state that have really nothing to do with the solar market per se. So things just like what level of income inequality exists within a state, the cost of living, factors like that can have a significant impact on solar adopter relative incomes. So everything up until this point has been really just looking at a snapshot of 2023 adopters. The next couple slides will look at how these trends have been evolving over time. And so the slide here shows two related trends. The line shows median solar adopter incomes over time. And you can see how those median incomes have been declining slowly, but fairly steadily over time. And then the shaded areas of the chart show the distribution of solar adopters into different income bins. And you can see correspondingly there that the share of solar adopters in the lower income tiers has been rising, while those in the highest income tier has been shrinking over time. And these temporal trends reflect really both kind of two separate factors that we try to distinguish. One is what we call a broadening, and the other we call a deepening of solar markets. And the next couple slides discuss those a little bit further. And so here, this figure shows the distribution of solar adopters based on median state level incomes. And so this figure here will look very familiar. It is quite similar to the figure a few slides ago where we showed the geographical distribution in where we grouped states by region. Instead, here we're grouping states by the median household income, looking at low, middle, and high income states. And you can see that although the trends, they kind of undulate over time, there has been generally a trend towards higher levels of or increasing market share by lower and middle income states. And Texas and Florida are really kind of the driving forces behind that. Solar market deepening really instead refers to this dynamic where within a given region, over time, we see solar adoption progressively accelerating among less affluent households. And we can measure that trend, albeit somewhat imprecisely, with our relative income metric. And so here you can see trends in relative solar adopter incomes compared to state, county, and tract level median incomes. For the state and county metrics, you can see, again, although the trends are sort of uneven over time, that there has been a general decline, reflecting a deepening of solar markets, at least at the state and county level. At the tract level, relative incomes have remained pretty flat and frankly been fairly close to parity over time anyway. And so one way of interpreting these trends here is that over time, solar adoption is progressively moving into less affluent tracts within a given county or within a given state. Now, because California is such a large part of our sample, one of the things we want to look at is to what extent some of these national trends are primarily reflecting some underlying dynamic in California, or conversely might be occurring in spite of some trend in California. And so here we just break out trends in median adopter incomes and relative incomes for California and for all other states. And I think the reassuring thing we see here is that the trends are pretty similar. So it's not that something unique or different is happening in California compared to other states. We see really kind of across the board solar adoption moving into less affluent households on an absolute basis and also on a relative basis. I think really the most notable difference we see here is particularly in looking at the relative income lines, the orange lines. Over the last couple of years, there's been a very sharp drop in California. And some of that might just be a kind of a regression to the mean, where you see in the years before that there was kind of an increase in relative incomes. But the California market has also been really transforming and evolving in some significant ways over the last couple of years. Many of you are probably familiar with changes in the net metering rules in California, but in addition, California has now requires PV on all new homes. And so that has also impacted some of the income-related trends we see in the state as PV on new homes take on a progressively larger share of the overall market. So last little slide here before handing things over to Sydney. We just show trends in the LMI, or low and moderate income, portion of solar adoption over time. This is kind of a busy slide, and that busyness just reflects the fact that there are lots of different ways that LMI can be defined. And so we show LMI shares based on various different thresholds defined in terms of area median income or federal poverty level. And although the absolute shares, of course, vary depending on how you define it. The trends over time are pretty consistent, and we see a slow but fairly steady increase in the LMI share of solar adoption over time. Last year, for example, about a quarter, 26% of solar adopters were less than 80% of area median income, and essentially half, 49%, were below 120% of area median income, which is often used to define LMI. So with that, I'm going to hand the baton over to Sydney, who will take us through the rest of the material.
Thanks,
Sydney, it's all yours. Yep.
Yeah, and so we have sort of two more chapters of results. The first is we're still staying in the family of income and looking at the solar installer attributes or solar installation attributes by different income levels. So next slide shows the three different breakdowns that we have. And again, we have a fourth breakdown in the report. We're just not going over it today on installer size. So first we'll be going over system size, ownership type, and then battery attachment with in compared to income. So first, system size. This figure is essentially kind of three figures squished together. What we're looking at essentially is in each of these three, we're moving from the lowest absolute income group to the highest absolute income group and looking at how system size changes with those different groupings. So we do this first for all states, and then we break down California versus the rest here. But regardless of where you are, you see a similar trend of sort of a stair step upwards, where we see that as householder income increases, so does the size of the solar system. This is just because likely larger systems cost more. Also, higher income households tend to have a higher electricity load that they're trying to offset maybe with their solar panels. And they also could just have a bigger house footprint with larger usable roof space. The one thing is, again, we did section out California because it is such a large percent of the sample. The system sizes are a little bit smaller in California, so that kind of brings the all states numbers down a little bit. But when you look at the all states, you look at that 6.4 kilowatts for the 50,000 and under versus the 8.0 kilowatts for the 200,000 and over. And you see here, that's a pretty big difference of about 25% when you go from the lowest income group to the highest income group in terms of size. So next slide, we're moving into third-party ownership rates by income level. So first, there are two types of ownership structures that we break it down into. One is sort of homeowner, the adopter owns a system, and then the other one is third-party ownership. So essentially, if you own the system, you can buy it outright or maybe get a loan to cover it. With third-party ownership, this is usually through a lease or a power purchase agreement. And it does lower some of the upfront cost barriers to PV adoption in that you don't need to put a bunch down right up front. So we have done some studies in the past to show that the option of third-party ownership does lead to some additional adoption. Third-party ownership also isn't available in all states. So you can also go to the report to see sort of the different breakdowns of the counts for each type of breakdown we do. But again, what you can see here is we have the same absolute income categories, and we go basically from the lowest income to the highest income group, looking at the percent of PV systems that are third-party owned. And the US average in 2023 was a bit above 20%, just for reference. So you see here that those households with $50,000 or less installed about a third of their systems with third-party owned structures versus just 18 in that highest income group. So that's a pretty sizable difference. Again, it's almost double again for the lowest income group. The one other quick note is that the Inflation Reduction Act did sort of amend some of the commercial tax rules for the ITC, the investment tax credit. So there are these different adders, and while it's not tied to household income, they do have a low income community adder, which is for different defined low income tracts or tribal areas and some specific buildings or projects. But that essentially came out towards the end of 2023. So we don't really see the impacts, or we don't anticipate really seeing the impacts in the data that we have out now, but we will see some impacts into the future, again, just because it was a change for the commercial tax rate. So only third-party owned systems are eligible for this bonus adder. And it sort of remains to be seen how that trickles down to the actual household itself, and what gets passed through from the third parties, but it could make third-party owned systems in those different regions a bit more attractive. So next slide. So here, the orange line, we see third-party ownership share of the entire sample. And what you can see here is just that it's gone a lot, it's gone down a lot since 2015. And actually, last year was the only uptick that we've seen in that time period. I did just mention the IRA, but it is most likely actually due to interest rates going up and loans looking relatively less attractive compared to some third-party owned offerings. So again, we will see in the future maybe some more action around there. It could be that, again, some of this tax credit adders could influence a bit more third-party ownership in the future. So we're definitely keeping an eye on that. And then the two lines up top kind of show the US spread of what we just showed in the previous slide. So just that the incomes of third-party owned systems are lower than host-owned systems. And again, we're watching to see what happens with these adders, but it could be the fact that if these adders work the way they're intended to, there might be more adoption by lower income households in that TPO range. So we could see a bit more separation, but again, we don't know what we'll see yet. We'll be interested in watching. So the next slide, we're moving into the third and final of this chapter, which is the storage attachment rates. And we see a similar structure in the figure as we did for the system size. So it's more important here that we break out California, just because we're just looking at, again, these solar plus storage systems. And California actually made up 63% of all of these paired systems in 2023. So you can see here that the sort of middle blue shade figures really do have a huge effect on those dark gray bars, more so than the other states. So California is a huge factor here. You can also see that California has far higher attachment rates than other states. For example, the lowest income group in California actually had a higher attachment rate than the highest income group in other states. So that is one particular thing to notice. But again, we see fairly consistent patterns across all of these, where as incomes get higher, attachment rates for storage also increase. And that again is due to the fact that storage often still comes at a premium for some added benefits that it can give, like resilience or some bill savings. So next slide. I think we are, moving on to some demographic trends and moving away from the income trends. So the next slide shows the different stuff that we get into in this presentation. Again, the stuff that is grayed out is covered in the report online at the link that Eric posted. But we'll be getting into 3 of these different breakdowns. Next slide. And this is sort of like the full compiling everything into one figure, just to show a breakdown of what solar adopters look like compared to their state averages. And again, what we're looking at is whether or not it's located within or outside of a disadvantaged community. So you can see here that solar adopters are 13% more likely than others in their state to be located outside of a disadvantaged community. They are 18% more likely to be non-Hispanic white than other people in their state or other households in their state. They're 36% more likely to have a higher income than others in their state, And then the last one we're going to be going over is just that they're 64% more likely to own a single family home. And Galen mentioned this earlier, but this is due to a bunch of things that are well researched, like split incentive, different barriers with accessing solar if you don't own your own roof and live in a single family home. So next slide. First, we are looking at the share of adopters that are located within disadvantaged communities. And this is for disadvantaged communities, we're using the US federal definition with their CGES tool. And this was a definition that was created in this administration, released in November 2022. So that's one caveat I'll say, is that this figure obviously goes back to 2010, but even though we see a huge increase from a doubling from 11% in 2010 to 22% in 2023, that is just more natural growth in those areas as opposed to something directly related to these tracts being named as such. So we do again see that increase over time, although we see that there's not a lot of difference between 2022 and 2023. But we do also, when we're looking at the blue bars, we're comparing it with the dotted orange line. It's essentially the same for if you look at all US households versus if you look at all US households that are weighted based on where our solar adopters are located. But essentially, it tells the same story, which is that solar adopters at the nation level are underrepresented within these disadvantaged communities compared to, again, like the US spread. So next slide shows it the same breakdown by state. So again, we're looking at the blue bars are the percentages in respective states. The yellow dots are each respective state's spread in terms of all of their households. And so again, you see that there's a lot of difference between different states. But pretty much with the exception of two, you see that those blue bars are below those yellow dots. And that essentially means that, again, that PV adopters are more likely to be located outside of disadvantaged communities than inside. And this is for 2023. The two exceptions are Pennsylvania and DC. And we did investigate this. It was essentially because a lot of PV adoption in general just takes place in these large metro areas where there just happens to be a large percent of the population that lives inside of DACs, so, or disadvantaged communities. But on average, across all states, essentially the percentage of households in DACs who adopt solar, it's about 9 points lower than their respective states. Next slide. I'm not going to go through this whole slide. I just thought it was important to make sure everyone was aware of where we got this information. So this is a prediction open source algorithm that we used, and based on the household census block group and the name of the householder, essentially the predictor spits out what race and ethnicity they think is best associated. We actually have people's own reported race and ethnicity for 1,500 adopters, sort of across our sample. And so using that, we were able to compare how accurate this was. And we found that there was a bit of an overprediction for Hispanic adopters and an under prediction of Asian adopters. However, when we just used a binary of if the adopter was non-Hispanic white or not, non-Hispanic white or not, the accuracy went way up. So that's what we use here. We just break down the binary essentially. So next slide. So this slide, we are, Galen kind of mentioned that when you control for owner occupancy, a lot of these different income trends get dampened. And the race and ethnicity portion is pretty interesting because here we actually see the trend reverse. So what we're looking at is in this figure, up and to the left means that minority households are overrepresented in our sample, which means that the adopter or the state is the adopters in a state are more likely to be minority households versus when it's below and to the right, it means that they're more likely to be white. The adopters are more likely to be white when compared to their state. Each bubble is a state, and the size of the bubble corresponds to the number of adopters within each state. So you can see here, starting with the empty bubbles. So these are when you use the comparison population of all households. You see that there are some exceptions, but pretty universally, everything is down to the right, which means that the adopters are whiter compared to all households in their state. When we control for owner occupancy, we again, now we're looking at the shaded in bubbles, and we see a migration of all these states up and to the left. So actually the story kind of reverses where these PV adopters are more likely to be minority households when you compare to owner occupancy or owner occupied houses in their state. So again, this is really emphasizing the importance of the comparison population. And so there's other stuff going on here that we don't really investigate fully in this report, but definitely an area of further exploration. Next slide. And this kind of drives that same point home a little bit. So two things. First is just comparing where the lines are. So PV adopters are the dark blue, and then the lighter blue is again just looking at the owner occupied households across the US, not just on a state level, but on a national level. You see that same trend where the share of minority adopters is higher than all US owner occupied households. But then the second thing we wanted to point out is just the rate of change. So the lines are fairly flat. So we see from 2016 and 2023, the share of minority PV adopters does increase by a little bit. But we also see that from 2016 and 2023, the sort of comparison population stays more or less the same. So what we're saying here is essentially that PV markets aren't really shifting towards states with higher or lower shares of owner-occupied households. And so again, some other factors might be at play in that minority growth. Next slide. So third and finally, I've been mentioning this whole time that we're comparing sometimes to owner-occupied households. And the reason we're able to do this is just because, again, because of some of these barriers of adopting solar if you're not an owner-occupied household. Most of our adopters are in that space. So 96% of the 2023 adopters were, they own their own homes. And so not only did they own their own homes, but these are single family owner occupied households. So if you look at that first figure, it's that dark gray. And when you compare it to the dark gray and the other two figures, which are across the US and then across the US, but weighted based on where our sample is, you see, obviously there's a ton more dark gray than in the different comparison populations. So only 4% are renter occupied, and it's important to note that almost all of these are still single family dwellers. So these are rentals, but they're still in single family homes. More than that, an even smaller portion are multifamily buildings, and a lot of these are things like condos or small multifamily units as opposed to sort of these large buildings. And when you look at the income for each of those 4 different tenure types, you see that single family owner occupied households make more money. And then if you are a renter and you live in a multifamily building, you know, in that order, incomes, median incomes across those adopters go down. Next slide. So getting to the end of our presentation, just to go over a bunch of things, because I know we talked about a lot. So we just want to highlight that solar adopters are heterogeneous in terms of their income and demographics. And this is, again, we ran through a bunch of different comparison populations, but it doesn't really matter how you cut it. You just see a lot of differences between adopters, but also we also show that they diverge from the general US population. they skew towards higher income, non-Hispanic, white, and for example, more owner-occupied single-family homes. And just to emphasize again how important the comparison population is, we saw that especially those income trends really got a lot smaller when you're comparing to just owner-occupied homes. And then in the case of race and ethnicity, the direction was actually reversed. So there was a sign change, which is pretty interesting as well. So just emphasizing again, it is important to consider who the comparison population is when presenting these results. So finally, data is showing that these differences are continuing to diminish over time. So essentially, solar adopters are looking more like their neighbors. And also, of course, there is a lot of variation between states, and that could have to do that could do with some things. Sorry, that has to do with some things at the state level, like different policies. And Galen mentioned some tariff changes going on in California, for example, that would have an impact as well that we don't investigate in this report, but again, is an area of further exploration. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Eric to do a demonstration of the tool, and then we'll have time for Q&A.
Great, thanks, Sydney. I am going to share my screen.
And as Eric starts sharing his screen, I'll just invite everyone to add any questions to the Q&A box that you'd like to have answered. We'll have a little bit of time at the end, so just want to make sure we get those in the queue while we can.
Yeah. So I'm just going to start here to prove how easy it is to get here with the URL Berkeley Lab Solar Demographics or something like that. And you'll see some choices here. And this is the landing page. So it's a convenient place to start, has all of our publications, not just this report, but all of our research on this topic. And over here in tools and data, you'll find the solar demographics tool. The demographics tool is pretty simple. So just these 4 plots here, and then a bunch of downloads down below. And the idea here is you have all of your filters up in the top, so you can choose between income and race and ethnicity as 2 different demographic choices. Within that, you have different choices of how you want to slice the data. So let's just say I want to look at it in terms of percent of area median income rather than income, absolute income. I can choose different levels. So in the tool, you have state and county. So just to say, let's say I want to find this Coconino County, and I can click on that. Well, that's not a good example, not enough data. So that there's these filters that ensure that we're not showing data for where we don't have enough. Down below, oftentimes we won't have enough data for systems, but if I come up here to state and say, look at California, I can see all these different choices. The different options here are just a snapshot of whatever the current year is, in this case, 2023, versus a time trend. You can kind of hover over and see all this, and then down below, different breakdowns in terms of system. And then the 2 options here are system size or the percent third party owned. You can kind of see some of the trends at different levels that were just presented. Last option, choosing in terms of race and ethnicity, and essentially 2 choices here. And then maybe the most interesting here is all the downloads. You can download the figures. You can make your own figures and download whatever figure you want. And over here, the choice is to download all of this data. And one thing mentioned here was the figures only available in national, state, or counties, but this is the spot to find track level data. So this is the most granular data that we provide. It's a pretty big file, but you can go ahead and click that. And I note down here below, if you see something wrong, please do send me a note. I have my email address down at the bottom. With that, I think I can stop sharing. I don't know if Gillian, if you want to bring back up something else to have in the background, otherwise it'll just be our faces. And there are a few questions I was looking at. So I'm going to frame these in a way to make sure that we can answer them in terms of the scope of this project. But one question, this is just maybe about getting support with information. So I think maybe that's one question, like how, if someone wanted to get kind of technical assistance, perhaps, how could one go about doing that with this type of research?
I can take a crack at that. So yeah, we often do get requests from outside entities to help provide some sort of analytical support. I mean, indeed, one of the reasons why we developed the data tool that Eric was just sharing was to allow some folks to be a little bit more self-sufficient, since often the questions that folks might have from a particular area are along the lines of, well, what do those trends look like for my state, my county, my area? And so the tool is useful for answering many of those questions, but in some cases it's not. And so we often do get requests from outside parties to develop some trends based on maybe a particular metric that we're not otherwise showing, or to kind of slice and dice the data in some way that we're otherwise not doing. And so you can always email us on the landing page that Eric shared with you. There's a little link where you can submit a request for analytical support. And so we're always happy to help how we can. The DOE and Solar Energy Technologies Office also has a variety of technical assistance programs that are kind of more formal programs that are really out there to help folks with more involved requests than, you know, some sort of ad hoc data analysis that we might be able to do. And so certainly if we get requests that are maybe beyond the scope of what we can easily turn around, we will always direct folks to the appropriate program within DOE where you can find more in-depth support.
And I just put the link to the Google form in the chat for everyone.
Great. And the second half of this individual's question, do you know of any research that quantifies, let's say, the impacts of rooftop solar on non-solar adopters, in particular in terms of energy demand tariffs? So I'll let you answer that as much as you want to, just noting it's not quite in the scope here.
I'm not aware of any research that has looked at that question specifically, but of course that question ventures into this whole space of kind of how does rooftop solar adoption or net metering sort of impact the electricity prices that other consumers pay? And this is often kind of framed and discussed in terms of cost shifts or cross subsidizations. And that's certainly well beyond the scope of this research, though there is quite a bit of work out there that has been done in that space. Happy to direct folks towards that if you're interested.
Great. Someone noted that in the past year, there's been some news coverage of third-party ownership and maybe some potential issues. So the question, should we be more concerned about third-party financing? And how do we best support low-income communities to access the financing frequently needed to install solar?
Yeah, so those questions also go a bit beyond the scope of this work. I will say that, what this study shows and some of our other work has shown is that third-party ownership and financing in general has been incredibly powerful in helping to support and accelerate adoption among less affluent households. And so I think it's always important to begin the discussion by acknowledging that financing is a really important and valuable tool. And so then the question is, how do you sort of ensure that financing is happening in a responsible way, not in not a predatory manner? And we haven't so far ourselves really looked at that, though we do have some upcoming work that will explore those issues. We have a study in the early stages that is really just trying to understand to what extent solar loan financing has helped to support increased adoption by LMI households. So some of the figures we presented here showed that third-party ownership has had a beneficial impact in those terms. But we really have not yet explored solar loan financing. And so we have some work underway that will look at that. We have another project underway, really trying to understand how well systems in the field are performing, and whether third-party owned systems perform better or worse than host-owned systems. And that question has been sort of infused within some of the media coverage that this question was referring to. And then lastly, I'll mention some potential work that we'll also be doing, just investigating consumer complaint data to understand sort of the prevalence of consumer complaints and the nature of consumer complaints when it comes to solar loan financing. So hopefully we'll have some more answers to related questions in the near future.
I think the only thing I'll add, because Galen kind of covered all of our upcoming work, is that there are some resources out there on good practices for different customer protections in the space of solar. It's not specific to third-party owned systems. It's kind of across the board again, like loans, leases, everything, but any sort of predatory lending. In different ways, I think there are some things that states could do to implement some consumer protections, and then those do exist. I can find what I'm thinking of and put it in the chat. It's not us, but might as well cross promote.
Someone asked about the slowdown in solar adoption, and wondered if that might be due to grid supply getting cleaner or a lack of program funding for income qualified households. I think maybe just a way to frame the question is, in your view, what are the key trends driving or not driving adoption across income levels nowadays?
So I think, I mean, there are a number of kind of fundamental factors at play. One is just the continued decline in system prices. At the same time, we've had at least a period of relatively high interest rates, which has impacted financing costs, and has at least sort of kind of dampened adoption, if not slowed it. And then, of course, you've got all sorts of programmatic efforts happening around the country. So, Solar for All is a major initiative that is getting rolled out under the Inflation Reduction Act. Various state and local programs continue to emerge. And so there's really just a really wide variety of innovative programs and efforts happening across the country that are driving markets locally. And to varying degrees, we see that in the national data as well.
Someone know that home ownership is such a huge factor, and then the question here kind of is if you could explain the role of federal tax credits and maybe how those shape income trends or influence solar and battery storage adoption trends.
I think we mentioned that 2023 introduced a big change to some of these tax credits. So in some ways it remains to be seen, but I think I emphasized that some of those tax credit adders will only pertain to third-party owned systems, not host-owned systems. So those are things like the EJ community adder, and then the low-income community adder, which includes tribal as well. In addition, there were some other things like the direct pay that changed, and so that would potentially increase solar adoption of larger systems where there is no tax, essentially like nonprofits, maybe municipal that had to previously get someone else with a tax appetite in order to adopt. So I think those are some changes that could take place. And then in terms of income levels, again, some of those adders, they aren't specific to household income eligibility. It's specific to a tract level. So I think that if it's successful, then it'll attract low-income households within low-income tracts. However, it's not as precise. So you will likely see an increase maybe in third-party owned systems, and especially in those areas, hopefully by low-income homes. But again, we're not really sure. We'll kind of see as it comes in.
Great. There's a question about if there's any specific trends in solar adoption in areas with difficult weather, say climate vulnerability, high hurricane rates, any specific trends in those areas?
I mean, well, California has battery adoption, so you could see battery attachment rates increase. After the public safety power shutoffs in California under the big IOUs, in Southern California and in Northern California, you saw some incentives for battery attachment, and a lot of people, took advantage of those. So you saw higher battery attachment rates. Galen, I'm not sure. We don't necessarily break that down in the report, I should say.
Yeah, and I might just say in general on that question, there's really a question about what trends you see in Georgia, for instance. That's also part of the idea of the tool, is you can go to the tool and explore that. And if you don't quite find the information you're looking for, it might be worth reaching out to us to see if there's any more detailed analysis we can do. I don't see any more questions. Is some comments here about other research on cost shifting, and some comments about recent trends in net billing. So someone might have a few seconds to sneak in a last minute question. Otherwise, I'll kick it over to Galen or Sydney to close us out.
Well, I'll say I see something here about the link to the Google form. I think for now, if you have a specific request, email myself or Galen or both. And we'll look into that link. It's opening for me, but it looks like there's some issues with other people opening. So we'll get that sorted out. But in the meantime, feel free to email us with the request.
Yeah, could be a Google form issue, Google permissions. All right, well, I think we can close it out now. We're just about at the top of the hour. So I want to thank all of you for joining, for your time, for your interest. Please do feel free to reach out if you have any follow-up questions or comments. This is an annual report, and so we're always looking for opportunities to improve and refine what we're doing. So very much appreciate any suggestions or ideas that you might have along those lines. And with that, we will say goodbye. Hope everybody has a fantastic holiday, and we hope to see you soon. Take care.
Thank you.